Hello, hello. Just need to get close over here. But good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I am coming on right now on camera to make a video, and today is Tuesday, and it's February 23rd, 24th. Yes, 24th, 2026, and the time is 2 p.m. exact, past 12 minutes. And I am attending an economic briefing from Brookings Institute regarding Trump's economic tariffs or economic policies that like everybody's still questioning today, from the American government to, the whole world. There's question of what tariffs actually meant to be and why they're being pushed. And today at night, around 9 p.m. in Eastern Standard Time, is going to be Trump's State of the Union address, which is required. It's a law to do that. In the United States, the president is supposed to address the nation every year, giving the economic outlook, giving the performance, giving all the sort of the information about whatever's going on in the world, in the country. So right now I'm attending Brookings Institute, and I just want to share some of the insights people are giving out. But just giving a quick updates. This was, I believe it was this week. Yeah, this was on the weekend when the Supreme Court of the United States passed ruled that tariffs were illegal, and they dismantled them. Also, they used the word strike those tariffs, and as soon as possible, Trump immediately went in the office, and they had a backup plan. So they immediately used another legal system to sort of pass other tariffs. Immediately they passed global tariffs of up to about 10%, and then they added another 5%, and then they took 5% off. Now they have 10%. So they have a backup plan that they are working on. There has been sort of an excuse from the government saying that the reason why they are increasing tariffs is to raise the revenue, because remember, tariffs is the same thing as taxes, right? It's not like a fee, it's taxation being imposed on imports. So let me view some of the. Let me go to the Brookings Institute, and let's hear some of the insights from these professionals.
For all that, last week's decision was quite resounding in SCOTUS's rebuke of one of the president's central foreign policy items. Many of our allies followed this decision closely. They were expecting there was a good chance that IEEPA would be struck down, at least in part, as a legal basis for tariffs going forward.
I'd skip forward because I was behind.
Manufacturing economy, it's often the 232 are just as much as the existing tariffs under IEEPA, and those tariffs, of course, haven't gone anywhere. As I've already mentioned, for some partners, this actually looks like not a bad deal. Most of Southeast Asia had actually clustered around a 19% effective tariff rate. So for them, whether Section 122 brings you down to 10% or 15%, it's relatively better off than you thought you were going to do under your negotiated agreement with the Trump administration previously. The thing where I think there is most uncertainty created is for those partners where there has not yet been an understanding reached. So one example is India, where we had expected Indian trade negotiators in Washington just this week, and they've called off their trip, perhaps to wait and see whether indeed the number they were negotiating towards is going to come in higher than the 122 rate, that therefore incentivizes.
So just now she touched on India. India signed a trade agreement with Europe. Then United States immediately jumped on and started also doing the same thing. Just keep that in mind, that that's what's going on now at the moment.
Take a close look and see if they can do better by deferring trade action to a later date, hoping that either 122s or a subsequent authority will bring them in at a lower tariff rate. But why don't I pass to Patrick's?
Thanks. That was a great answer. I think part of my response will depend on where the Section 122 rate ultimately lands. So if we stay at 10% across the board, trading partners won't have much room here to complain, because they will either have the same deal in terms of tariff rate that they had under IEEPA, or they'll have a better deal, and in some cases a much better deal. So if the 122 rate stays at 10%, I don't expect that any trading partners will attempt to use this as a basis for walking away from what they've already negotiated. In terms of the countries that don't yet have a deal or are still involved in negotiations, again here, I don't think that there are going to be major changes, because while it's true that the IEEPA tariffs were the forcing mechanism that directly brought these negotiating partners to the table, at a more foundational level, it wasn't really the IEEPA tariffs themselves. It was that this threat that the United States would suddenly impose much higher tariff rates in the future. And given some of the other statutory authorities that we've already discussed, that threat remains. So I think the dynamic really won't change much, even for these countries that haven't reached a negotiated bilateral arrangement yet.
Lots of nods when you said it's the threat that matters to our foreign partners, and I suspect that's the case to private sector as well. So moving into a little bit more of what are the impacts that we're seeing in the real world as a consequence of this decision, I want to bring in Emily Blanchard, Dartmouth economics professor and former chief economist at the State Department. From the perspective of somebody who is an economic scholar and somebody who has been on the front lines of U.S. foreign policy, I'd like to get a sense of how you view this development, in particular from a macroeconomics and trade perspective. Is this ruling economically material? Do those nods mean not really? Does it change expectations in a meaningful way? Does it matter for business decisions, investment, sourcing, supply chains, or as you very famously say, global value chains? Tell us more.
Sure, great set of questions, and I'm just delighted to be here. Yeah, I think this does material. The decision, both the striking down of the IEEPA decision and the new tariffs, even if the tariffs started at 10% for a given country and stayed at 10% for a given country, I still think there are real economic consequences of these two decisions. And you flagged it, Kari, precisely through the expectations mechanism. So firms are always making decisions in I think Mira flagged, a highly uncertain economic environment as they're trying to price in and respond to a lot of uncertainty. So the question is, are they now working with a new set of expectations over what they could expect in the future? Both, the worst possible threats, do those look different? Or, and I actually think this is one of the most important decisions, they've now seen on Friday, first, the IEEPA tariffs are gone, so that tariff authority is no longer there. But maybe the most important news item for a firm operating today is this administration is bound and determined to keep those tariffs in place at any opportunity. And there was a chance, certainly, I think there was a chance, a fairly strong chance, or thought that there was a fairly strong chance that if IEEPA was struck down, as it was last Friday, there was a door open for the Trump administration to put a pause on tariffs and maybe take the political win in the sense of saying, hey, the Supreme Court, you can berate the Supreme Court as the president did. The Supreme Court is forcing us to stop with our tariff escalation. darn their gnarly hides, but what can we do? And the what can we do would make sense from a political perspective. The tariffs are a drag on real economic activity. The U.S. economy is starting to show some signs of softness, maybe directly related to tariffs. Tariffs, of course, do obviously and mechanically increase the cost of living for American consumers. We're 9 months out from an election. It would not be crazy for the administration to have said, okay, we're bummed about these tariffs. We didn't have to say we backed down, but to not go back in and try again to re-up the tariffs. So the new news, the big news for firms is nope. This as of Friday, it is very clear that the administration is going to continue to pursue these high tariffs through other tariff authorities. And Pat laid it out so clearly for 122 for the next 150 days, and then following on that, probably Section 301, 232, what have you, the various Trade Act of 1974 and 62, those various provisions. So I think firms are looking at the world differently, and that does mean that they are going to make maybe different changes. So I won't drone on and on, but just a couple of flags for the kinds of changes that I would expect firms to make as they update their priors about what they can expect in future months and potentially years. Number one, pricing. I think a lot of firms have not updated their price pass-through decisions because they've been waiting on the Supreme Court decision on AIPA, waiting to see if maybe the administration would back down if AIPA was struck down. So maybe we'll start to see higher price pass-through from firms, importing firms to consumers. We've already seen in a bunch of places, and there's some very compelling economic studies that price pass-through can be very high in certain channels. But there was a lot of buildup of inventories that softened the price blow. Now, if you're looking ahead to a future where, as a firm, maybe you expect these tariffs to be in place with near certainty.
So, commenting on these professors, Professor Emery, comment about the prices, for the past year, the prices haven't gone up. Okay, there has been steadily similar to 2024. In fact, many companies, they took on the losses just to cover up, to avoid getting, backlash from Donald Trump, because Donald Trump tries to attack these companies. But this is not going to go on for so long. And remember, there's still a huge batch of unemployment rate going on. And the companies, they don't want to hire because they are sort of scared, or they have skeptical of the decision from the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court is ruling that tariffs are illegal. Instead of Trump, like she said, instead of Trump saying, hey, we tried it, it's not our fault, it's the Supreme Court fault, let's pause from here, let's move on. They consistently passed even more tariffs. So they literally passed other tariffs. But anyway, let's see what she has to say. But if you look at the market, the prices haven't gone up. Not because businesses are very nice, but it's because they are taking in the losses. They are not making any profit. Since last year, they've been waiting for the government to make decisions on probably hoping that the tariffs will go down. But you will see the price on the market anytime soon, and it's not going to be fun. And then remember, when the prices go up, they never go down. They always go up. So we are going to expect a huge inflation. A lot of work from the new chairperson of the Federal Reserve in June next couple months. But actually, you're gonna have to select a new chairperson. Okay, let's back on to the event.
Tax law in a way that tax law has not been settled for the last 25 years of continually expiring and then negotiated extensions of provisions. That bill permanently reduced revenues by $4 trillion over 10 years, but it did set rates for businesses and individuals in a permanent way on an ongoing basis. So we actually left the summer with a period of stability. However, we dug ourselves deeper into a fiscal hole, and some of the promise of these tariffs was the upside is that we are a net importer. That actually is quite a big base to tax with a tariff. And so there's always been revenue potential there. You just have to be careful because of all of the things that we've talked about across all of the experts on this call with how you use tariffs to raise revenue versus affect trade flows. So where we are now on the other side of IEEPA is the CBO recently forecasted that the sort of the suite of the Trump administration tariffs was going to potentially bring in $3 trillion over 10 years in extra revenue, which, could have offset actually a substantial portion of the cost of the tax bill last summer. And now those dollars will evaporate. And so if you think about the volatility in tariff revenue, it's not that tariffs themselves have historically contributed a lot to the federal budget, but since 2018, there has been a trend. When the first Trump administration put tariffs in place, the Biden administration sort of held the line, and now they've ramped up from being about $7 billion a month in revenue to 30. With the IEEPA tariffs, there was a substantial chunk of change coming in the door that raised different fiscal questions about whether tariffs could be a long-run sustainable source of revenue in light of what...
That's interesting. That's actually interesting, actually. This is very interesting because that's why I'm thinking like Trump is doing this with an intention, right? And I'm trying to think right now, could Trump trying to shift from domestic taxation to international taxation? So instead of taxing people in the United States, tax people who are buying from overseas. That way there's an imbalance. Think about this, right? A lot of things in the United States are expensive because of the taxes added to it. Sales tax, income tax, like all the things become more expensive. But let's say you have to buy a car from China and the car comes in with a tariff of 10%, 20% on that car. And if the price of a car is $30 and, $30,000 with an added tax, maybe comes out to $40,000. People have to decide, can I buy a Chinese car or buy an American car? And people have to think, can we manufacture those cars in the United States for a much cheaper price? That will create an imbalance. I think what Trump was doing, which is we are not understanding why he's doing this. Maybe there's misunderstanding in it. It's probably when he said deficit, it's not to ensure that there is no one-sided, right? There is an equal trading balance instead of imbalance. For instance, Americans can buy a bunch of stuff from China despite spend less money, but they will buy less. So because of that, more and more corporations go to China to build those stuffs for cheap labor and instead of the United States being in the market, right? So maybe that's what he's trying to do. Another thing is, if people truly want to buy Chinese goods or any other goods from Mexico and Canada, they would have to be constrained by the prices, and they have to spend that money to the foreign goods or foreign imported goods, and then in return they will have to pay the taxes, the tariffs money, and the government will use that money to subsidize local businesses, or maybe increase education, or maybe sponsor innovations, whatever they have to do. Either way, this seems like sounds like that's where we're heading at, because many countries, mind you, except the United States, every other country benefits a lot from the import, especially in Africa and Asia. Those countries benefits a lot from the import. Only China benefits a lot from export. Okay. Either way, we don't know what Trump is heading, but I'm pretty sure Trump administration, with no political bias in here, is doing something that is going to be a massive explosion of revenue that we will never see before, and we just have to keep an eye out. However, it could also backfire with employment rate. Companies might be incentivized to disincentivize to invest or hire, or even put in the revenue. They might just pull back and shut down the door and just do the business, put out their money and stop. Okay, it's all about how we're gonna address this, and we're gonna see this from this. I'm pretty sure everybody right now, including the investors, now they are watching. They are going to be watching the State of the Union to see what's going to be said or answered. Anyway, let me go back to the video to watch Patrick what he has to say.
Against the United States. So the first step in a Section 301 process is to establish that sort of act, policy, or practice is occurring or is in place in that trading partner. And then once that's determined, so we have an actionability determination, i.e. that there's an act that we can impose tariffs based upon. Then the question is how best to use the trade remedies that are available to convince our trading partner to change that act, policy, or practice. And the president, in collaboration with USTR, could certainly determine that the best way to convince a trading partner to change the act, policy, or practice under investigation is to put tariffs on goods of that country, and in fact, to put tariffs on all goods of that country that are exported to the United States.
Do you want me to jump in, Kari?
I actually want you to hold because I have a better one for you to answer. But first, I'm going to ask a question for Mira, and you can incorporate your answer to this after I get to Mira. So we're getting some questions from the audience about the foreign affairs power and the Supreme Court's ruling on the foreign affairs power and how it differs from taxing power. Given what they found, I'm going to say this wrong, so Pat, close your ears, that the Congress wouldn't have likely delegated tariffs as a foreign affairs power, but given the fact that the president was very clearly using tariffs as a foreign policy tool, what do you think how governments might change their overall strategic calculus vis-a-vis the United States?
It's an interesting question. My sense is, for the time being, and I think this is sort of consistent with what I said earlier, our partners are taking an extremely cautious approach. Exactly as Patrick said, the threat of tariffs under IEEPA were as much as about the threat as they were about IEEPA or what Congress did or did not delegate to the president. And from their perspective, they believe we're now living in a world in which, as Emily rightly laid out, it is very clear that this administration intends to keep tariffs high no matter what, and intends to use whatever authority is necessary to try to get back to levels that are closer to those Liberation Day levels, despite the fact that IEEPA is now on the cutting room floor. It's not my impression, at least from the conversations I've had with senior government officials around the world, that they are more broadly interpreting the delegation of the foreign affairs power. Rather, they're looking at this as an instance during this Trump administration of the Supreme Court having drawn a clear line in the sand about what the president can and cannot do. And now they're watching the administration kind of move on and try to do that same thing again under different authorities. So at least thus far, I don't see a whole lot of lessons learned about foreign affairs power delegation, but we'll certainly have a bunch of time as folks continue to grapple with the decision to look at that question further.
And so back to Emily, if you can kind of take what both Pat and Mira just said and maybe think about how tariffs are used both for strategic and economic purposes, and having some flexibility to implement tariffs might have some advantages in strategic interactions that certainty has advantages in economic interactions. And can you kind of talk about whether there is a trade-off there and what kind of solutions might there be?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great set of questions. So yes, and you said it, Kari. I mean, it's not a surprise. We think very similarly about these things. But I think the uncertainty that can be useful, there can be strategic ambiguity in foreign policy, particularly in these bilateral negotiations. That same strategic ambiguity is kryptonite for firms, right? This is much harder to operate, that strategic ambiguity. What are we going to do? Will we, won't we raise tariffs? It makes it very difficult for firms to make planning decisions. And so that has real economic consequences. And to be clear, for trading partners on both sides of a bilateral relationship and for trading partners elsewhere too, because the global economy is all interconnected. So there is absolutely a trade-off there. I want to cite one other really interesting trade-off as we think about the policy objectives, both economic and political and foreign policy objectives of the Trump administration. And I just want to acknowledge a really important conflict. If the tariffs are meant to induce reshoring in the United States, as the president will often say, I'm sure he's going to talk about, revitalizing American manufacturing in the State of the Union tonight. He's going to say tariffs are a key plank in the strategy to do that. If the tariffs are meant to induce reshoring and therefore to reduce import volumes into the United States, they will not, by definition, be generating as much revenue. But if the goal of the tariffs is to generate revenue or to impose costs on foreign trading partners, well, then we're not going to get the reshoring. And so there is this natural tension, this unavoidable tension in the objectives as articulated by the Trump administration. And I think as time goes on, that will be clearer and clearer, not only on the U.S. side, but for our trading partners overseas as they sort of look around to a changed landscape. So I think that's a really important thing to just keep in the back of our minds, is that you can't have all of these objectives at the same time. The one other thing I just wanted to flag on IEEPA versus the 301 facsimile of IEEPA. Can we put in place a bunch of 301 or maybe Section 232 with maybe some carve-outs, set of tariffs that mimics the IEEPA tariffs that were in place before? This is more obviously Pat's venue than mine. I don't see why not in terms of the tariff structure. But again, think about a lot of the impact of tariffs, again, for firm decision-making and for foreign policy, is in the threat capacity and the ability to very quickly ramp up and ramp down those tariff threats. So a Section 301, for example, you have to have done a investigation and found a basis for each of these trading partners that could be hit by these, which means you cannot overnight turn on a tariff against a country against whom you have not done a Section 301 investigation into their acts, policies, and practices. So I think the threat value is quite different. We might get a facsimile of the tariff structure, but we don't have a facsimile of the IEEPA flexibility, which is really important for bargaining.
Thanks, Emily. That's really helpful. I want to invite anybody else to come in and add anything to the sort of immediate real world effects. If not, we'll move on to try to look through 2026 and beyond to the future of U.S. trade policy in the near and sort of medium term, if you will. So starting with Elena, you've written about how the scale of this tariff exercise has been really important. And when tariffs reach the scale of major tax legislation, are we still talking about a case of delegated authority, or are we talking about fiscal policy making that requires congressional ownership? You talked a little bit about that in your opening remarks, but can you elaborate on what that means looking forward?
Yeah, I think that the Supreme Court basically teed this up for Congress in the way that the majority opinion came down. My read of it is that it was the scale of what was going on that in some sense tipped the balance, along with many other data points, I think, against the administration's argument for the use of IEEPA. And so it really does beg Congress to weigh in.
All right, I'm going to step out real quick on this discussion and everything I just mentioned right now. I've been talking about this all the time in my videos, and I have been having discussion with the people in my group chat, mostly college kids from different universities in the United States, and these things are real. Like they just gonna be happening. Like we're gonna see huge challenges coming ahead. But anyways, I'll make a quick reference here. Some ambulance, thank somebody. But you heard they mentioned the word IEEPA many times. All right, IEEPA is I'm gonna take a moment here and explain it, and then I'm gonna cut off the camera and go take a nap because I'm really tired. I just come off the gym. And I woke up at 6:30, so I need to take a nap, at least a 10 minutes nap, because I'm really tired. But here it is, right? The IEEPA, stands for International Emergency Economic Powers Act, okay, or IEEPA. Okay, so I'm reading the Supreme Court guidelines. This is the Supreme Court's guidelines, and it says, it's titled Learning Resources Inc. ETL versus Trump, President of the United States, ETL. Okay, number 241287. The argument took place on November 5th, 2025, and decision was made on February 20th, 2026. Okay, the question presented is whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, authorizes the President to impose tariffs. Okay, that was the question. Does the IEEPA actually authorize the President to impose? That was the question. Does this allow Trump to impose tariffs, or the President of any kind? Section 91, Statute 1626. Shortly after taking the office, President Trump, let me zoom in because I cannot see, I'm getting old, I need some eyeglasses. I need to zoom in. Section 91, Statute 1626. Shortly after taking the office, President Trump sought to address two foreign threats: the influx of illegal drugs from Canada, Mexico, and China. Presidential Proclamation number 10886, 90, Fed Registration 83, Federal Registration 8327, Executive Order number 14193, 90, Federal Registration 9113, Executive Order number 14194, 90, Federal Registration 9117, Executive Order number 14195, 90, Federal Registration 9121, and large and persistent trade deficits, Executive Order number 14257, 90, Federal Registration 15041, excuse me on that. The President determined that the drug influx had created a public health crisis, 90, Federal Registration 9113, and that the trade deficit had led to the harrowing out of the American manufacturing base and undermining critical supply chains, ID at 15041. The President declared a national emergency as to both threats, deeming them unusual and extraordinary, and involved his authority under IEEPA to respond. He imposed tariffs to deal with each threat, as the drug trafficking tariffs. The President imposed a 25% duty on most Canadian and Mexican imports, and a 10% duty on most Chinese imports. ID at 9114, 9118, 9122, 9123. As the trade deficit reciprocal reciprocal tariffs, the President imposed a duty on all imports from all trading partners. Okay. Of together with number 25250, Trump, President of the United States, ATL v. VSOS Selection Inc. Okay. Of at least 10%, with dozens of nations facing higher rates. ID at 15045, 15049. Since imposing each set of tariffs, the President has issued several increases, reduction, and other modifications. I said this, you can look at my videos. I made an entire 1 hour, almost an hour and a half of video reading all the executive orders, how they got modified. All of this went to court. They didn't go for granted, and they also didn't just remove them for no reason. There's so many lawsuits going on about these things, and this costs money. Keep that in mind. Practitioners in learning resource and respondents in VOS selections filed a suit alleging that IPA does not authorize the reciprocal or drug trafficking tariffs. The learning resource plaintiffs, two small businesses, sued in United States District Court for the District of Columbia. That court denied the government's motion to transfer the case to the United States Court of International Trade, and granted the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction, concluding that IPA did not grant the president the power to impose tariffs. Okay, so this is, keep that in mind, it says does not grant the power to impose tariffs. The VOS selection plaintiffs, 5 small businesses and 12 states sued the CIT, okay, Court of International Trade. Okay, 12 states. That has to be with California, the states that are in cost, because when tariffs are imposed on this international trade, states on the coast suffers the most because they are the one who bring in the revenues and imports. So California, Washington State and New York State and Texas, many other states that they are not mentioned here, but probably was one of those. All right. So it's a very long court hearing that I can read here, I can go on and on, but it was ruled as illegal that he cannot use this Emergency Act to pass the tariffs. All right. Let me hear the last more time. I have 2 minutes before I turn off the camera, and then we can call it a day.
First policy, and the interviewer said that sounds a lot like foreign policy for the middle class, and it's really quite true in that shared objective. That said, I do think the emphasis on bilateral trade deficits is very much a Trump thing. I don't think it's fair to put that on the Biden administration. I don't think most officials in the Biden administration would have identified bilateral trade deficits, especially in goods only, as a problem that needs fixing. I think they also would have had very different ideas about how to address bilateral global imbalances generally outside of certain lanes, maybe U.S.-China, but even there, very, very different approaches. But I think that's really key. Also, the difference in revenue and the focus on revenue generation. So that's one where I just want to flag that's quite distinct. The other thing where I think there's a huge potential difference going forward, and this is not even necessarily Democrat versus Republican, but the next administration, to go back to Kari's earlier question, what are tariffs uniquely suited to do? Are tariffs the best way to boost manufacturing, employment, manufacturing production in the United States? And I think there the answer is quite clearly no. Tariffs are a pretty crummy way to do that, especially in the modern global economy, where the manufacturing sector imports enormous shares of our imported parts, components, raw materials from overseas. Tariffs actually make American manufacturing firms less competitive, not more. So what might we see going forward? I would hope that Congress comes out of these next few years, at least the last year, but hopefully not too much longer, and says, you know what, we really do need to step up. If we believe, as Congress, as representatives of the American people, that is.
So I couldn't go any more longer. I think I already had enough discussion about this. But I understand the criticism, right? That the administration is not doing enough. They know. What's the solution though? Because they all recognize, both the Democrat and the Republican, that there is a trade deficit, and that the previous administration did not actually fix that. Okay, so what's the solution? If we don't want tariffs, what else do we do? All right. That's also I leave out there for people to watch in the future and get making decisions. Other than that, thanks for watching. Like always, ciao ciao, adios, spasiba. Thanks for watching.